No.
Okay.
Okay. Should we share the screen? Rafa, do you want to share yours?
I can share, and then I can just go. Let me just do some things in my. But yeah, I can share. Can you give me co-hosting privileges while I?
Done.
Okay. So wait just a moment. So folks, before we start, just want to say thank you for coming. I think we are very excited with what we developed in these past few months. I just like to start saying that we are like, just as a general introduction, this is a text that has the current title of Thesis on the Logics of Social Worlds. It's a working title. We have not discussed this completely. I think we didn't have even a meeting to discuss like what is the name, but I think it's good that we're not losing ourselves in this. So this is a good sign, I think. This is a text that will be if all works in a chapter in the book edited by Conrad Hamilton on real abstraction that will be on Brill series on historical materialism, I think. Caron is also contributing a chapter on his legendary real abstraction and the given essay.
The rag essay.
Ragaba? No.
Rag, real abstraction and the given. Rag.
Okay. Ragtime. So it will be, I think, like a very good, like we will one up everyone in the book if we manage to contribute also our collective contribution. We have a semi-official deadline for the 31st of March. And I say semi-official because it was we were not so sure when would be the final date, so we just put it to the end of March. And we are currently almost completing the first full draft. So as you can see, we are a bit late on schedule, but at the same time, I think that it's not completely a problem because most of the stuff has been discussed and worked out. And even in the case that they do not accept our text because of the time, I still think what we did here is a worthy contribution that actually develops and explains a lot of the insights that we've been trying to work collectively in the past few years. So I think that it was a good occasion. It will be excellent for all our curriculums if we manage to publish a text on Brill, and also for the group. But I think that as people who checked already the text, it's much more than that. I think it's an actual contribution to some of the things that we've been developing lately. Currently, we have 44 pages. We were aiming for 30, I think, which is, I think, improvement, because for the Atlas, we also had an aim of 30 pages and we did about 150. So, I mean, we're getting good.
May I say very quickly something about this? It's me who kind of determined like 30 pages because I thought we had to aim low. Otherwise, it would end up being like the Atlas. So I said 30, but I think 44 is fine. My paper has 47 or something. So yeah.
Yes.
Squad goals.
Squad goals.
This is squad goals. I said 30, but I knew you guys were going to write like 45 or something.
So, man, this is like, we are a family already. This is full mode day. So, so I think like in general, I think like this text is really good because as you will see, there was a initial pitch that was to work out the relations between world systems theory and real abstraction, because this is a book on real abstraction. But since we are narcissistic motherfuckers, what we did was end up talking just about how STP is great. Well, this is just a joke, but I do think that actually it was very good to see how we can position ourselves in a wider field. So just to explain very briefly what we want to do in this meeting, this is a intended short presentation, and short presentation in the sense that Carol just said that we have squad goals. And it will be divided into 3 parts. Yeah, I mean, it's basically that. So there will be like revision guidelines, which will be like instructions for the types of suggestions, proposed cuts, etc. We will do a play-by-play exposition of the main points of the text. This may take a bit long, but I think we could try and aim for being finished with this part till 7. Don't know if that's possible, but that would give us like a 45-minute presentation. And then the third part would be a debate where we can, of course, debate issues in the text. But this is something that I want to emphasize right now. Even though this is like a contribution to our ongoing project, we should be very clear that we have a deadline. So we cannot discuss the sex of the angels at this moment. We have to be focused on what makes the contribution advance towards its goal, which is the publication. So I think we should have that in mind when we are discussing. I mean, I think it would be great to have like further developments of this text later on. We've talked about this in the writing group, but let's just keep in our minds what's at stake at this moment and this meeting. That's why we decided to start with the revision guidelines, because in a sense, I think it allows, where's my mouse? Okay. It allows us to see what kind of interaction we are looking for at this moment, what kind of engagement with the text. And we divided it into 3 types of revisions, 4 types of revisions, actually. The first thing, and this is like fundamental, everyone that touches the text, please do not edit the text directly. This is very important. Do not edit the text directly. Not because, it's because we are at the final sprint. So it's very important that if some suggestions are made, and even if they are good, even if they are incredible, maybe they will not be able to be fully developed in the text. So we need to have a simple way to differentiate what will be worked out today, this following week, but we also need to be able to have a clear view of what are suggestions. And we did a little instruction manual, which is divided into revisions that are allowed in the footnotes, and revisions that are not allowed. Now that I think we should have started just with the negative aspects, like what we are not supposed to do. So I'll just start with that because this is, I think, more important. First things first, there are no suggestions that should be made that change the text. This is very important. Again, not because the ideas are unworthy, but because we have a deadline. So this was something that was developed over a series of discussions, over a series of meetings, over a series of writings. So I think that we have to have a clear idea that the main structure of the text, the problems discussed in the text, the objects of analysis, for example, world systems theory and real abstraction and STP's ideas of social world, these are things that are not to be changed. We are not going to alter this. We are not also going to alter the commitments that drive the text. There are some theses that we develop in the text that are set, and to change them would mean to change the whole text. This is not something that we can do. This does not mean that we cannot change these core theses in the future. I think this is very important to highlight. We should, I think, work this text collectively in the future. And just as an example, I think me and Caron, when we gave a class on some STP text, it was very good to talk and discuss. A lot of new ideas came about, but I think we should differentiate what is a change, a real change, and what is a revision. So yeah, this is very good. Revise it to make it itself, not to make it other than itself. This is very fundamental. So this is just like a moment in time of STP history. This is not the final say, but it is the say of the moment. So we should have this really, and if you want to make like fundamental changes, this is a great opportunity to schedule meetings, because we actually don't have much meetings in the future. I think, I mean, at least at the schedule. So if someone has like, oh, look, I disagree with your take on world systems theory, great, let's do a meeting on it. So I think this is like the first point. The second point, revisions that are allowed in the body of the text. So folks, this is like the meat of the thing. There are two types of revisions that we thought. First one, grammatical corrections. Of course, I mean, I think most of us are not native English language speakers. So it's natural that there will be many parts of the text that might be not so direct, not so clear. So please feel free to suggest corrections, suggest grammatical corrections. Other types of additional revisions in the body of the text are explanations of ideas. So if something is unclear and you understand what is going on, you can complement this. You can suggest this addition in the body of the text. So conceptual clarifications, examples, anything that makes something clear. So just to point this out, it's not about adding substantial stuff, but stuff that makes the text as, I mean, this is like, I like revise it to make itself even more. I like this phrase. It reminds me a lot of, we are in the business of refashioning vocabularies. We are in the business of refashioning vocabularies, but in this case, only to make itself even more and not to make it other than itself. So these are the revisions allowed in the body of the text. There are another type of revision in the text, which is subtraction. I think this is very important because, but at least Caron gave us something that is better, like it makes us, at least myself, happier. But we are megalomaniacal. We know that. So, like, I mean, there's lots of stuff that we added that makes it a lot of space. So there are possible cuts. There are lots of types of cuts that can be suggested. I put some examples there, but they are just example, like repetitions, things that don't need example, things that are tangential to the argument, or sections that might seem to be supplements more than integral to the argument. But I think the main thing when we are doing cuts, when we are suggesting cuts, is first that you signal the cuts through comments. So don't select and delete, even in suggestion mode, because this will not help us. We want you to select the place where you will cut, and then explain briefly, repetition, example, no need, but you need to explain in the comment. So that way we have a simple form of going through the suggested cuts. These cuts are not final, so don't worry. You can be creative in the cutting suggestions if you want. They will be approved or rejected considering the size restrictions, and maybe even like considering what Caron just said, maybe these cuts won't be used now, but if they think that the text is too large, we can base ourselves on these proposed cuts. But
just quickly, mind you that it's 44 pages without the diagrams and all of that. So it still
no, of course,
it can still be too long. Just keep that in mind.
I agree, but I don't think this text will have much more diagrams, but this is good. I mean, it's not to not suggest cuts, but I think that it's open whether we will accept all of them, not because we don't want cuts, but because the idea of cuts is fitting into this space, not like unless you think that there's this is like totally unnecessary. You can also propose those cuts, but just to have this in mind. So aside from that, there are other types of revisions that are allowed in footnotes. We can have complementing footnotes like points, like references, and this is like things that expand, but not in the main body of the text. You can put like reference to text by STP or by members of the STP. You can put references to authors mentioned in the text. For example, we have a lot of discussion on world system theory. So if you have an enormous library of references of WST, feel free to add the bibliographical references in certain points, always in suggestion mode. But I think it's important to remember, because some people might not know this, because this was something that we discussed. This text is divided in 3 parts: world system theory, real abstraction, and STP. And we've chosen to treat STP as an authorial entity, in the sense that we are not referring ourselves constantly to Badiou and to Karatani, because, well, we have enough distinctions with them to warrant not being totally reduced by them. This does not mean that we cannot reference them in footnotes, but I think that it's important to see that this is an attempt, I think, to see that this de-Badiouanization and de-Karatanization is part of the attempt to assume ourselves in a more authorial point of view. So this is because otherwise we'd have to like introduce Badiou, introduce Karatani, and then say, this is how we do differently from them. So, I mean, we can pretend to be dead European authors for a while. Nobody will suffer with that, I think, if STP tries to be a white European dead author. Other things that can be suggested are alternative paths. This means that if there are alternative paths that are not explored in the text, this could be appeared in footnotes. But alternative paths, and I think this should be clear, is not, oh, I have an insight that might be developed. We need something that's a little bit more structured, because this is not like an alternative path in the sense that, oh, people have different opinions in STP. This is like, well, as a group, we can go in one set of directions from certain set of commitments, or if we take some different commitments, change some of them, this would lead us in another direction. So it's not really like, oh, there's a variety of paths we can choose. It's more in the sense that, well, there are many ways to treat certain problems, but in this text, we focused on this path, okay? And this is important because it's important, I think, to not sound eclectic. We are not an eclectic bunch. And I think this text proves it in a lot of sense. Well, so I think that's the revision part. Anybody wants to put another input in regards to revisions or not?
Just a comment. I think that revisions footnotes could take the form of thinking like that. On this point, there is, for an alternative commitment on this point, for an alternative view that takes this and like this, see this and that, right? The good thing about footnotes is that in text, if you mention an idea, you need to explain it in detail and add all the references, and actually not only the book name. In a footnote, you can say, for an alternative approach to this, please see this book, right? So that really facilitates. I also think that there is something we forgot to add in the revisions, but that's crucial, which is not just corrections, which actually is an additive point, which is I think we know the references to everything we're saying there, in the sense of what will be in the footnote in terms of, this is the author, the anthropologist, the sociologist, the political economist that is backing up what we said in the text. But for some of the things, it would be great if people could also add their own footnotes that are just, let's say, further substantializing what was said. So it's not changing, it's not commenting, it's just substantializing. So, if you recall a passage from Marx that has to do with what we just said, put it in the footnote. See Marx, page, blah, 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 right? See Levi-Strauss, page, blah, blah, blah. Especially the mathematics, like good text on topology, semantics of, weird paraconsistency topologies and things like this, like whatever helps with that, it would be great. And I think that there's also something we didn't mention, which is really important, which is besides punctual revisions, we need two types of commitments from people. The first is some people who would like to read the whole thing, not really making punctual comments, but just making sure it looks like a homogeneous whole. So if we use a term in one place with another term somewhere else, note that, try to, change it so that it looks the same, things like that. And people who can do the formatting once it's done. So let's say on the very last day, we should probably end revisions on the 30th. So on Thursday, and on Friday, somebody or a couple of people will be up for formatting, just taking it, making sure the bibliography is correct, the footnotes are all in the same format and things like that. It takes a bit of work, but I think it's good to recall something we also didn't say is that everyone who touches the text in any way and can put their name on the first footnote of the text, which will be just a long list of names of everyone who's part of STP and worked on the text, right? So there is something to gain from it, from doing these chores.
Yeah, this that Gabriel said is very important. I think that this is a collective text, so there are many ways to contribute, and it would be very important if people would do that type of discussion of revisions that we need for the final version. Just let me answer something that John said. These are great instructions, probably useful for the future. Yes, I think that we can enhance these instructions. I think that can be used in other moments. So I think that this is something that would be useful. I don't know if the wind up as a PDF or is it you're talking about the instructions for revisions, instructions for revisions, sorry. Or is that, the final text is going to be published on an edited book collection by Conrad Hamilton on real abstraction. So it's going to be on Brill.
For help with formatting at the end, is that help turning it into a PDF or something else?
Oh, to send it.
Yeah.
This is what we are trying to discover, right?
Yeah, I sent a message to Conrad to know about that. In my case, I just shared my Google Doc with the working version of my paper to him, and they approved of that, and that was enough. But I'm not sure if they want really like a final document. I think that there will be some editing process going on until the book reaches a final kind of state. But he didn't say that really to me. I just kind of take it from the way things are going in a way, because I found it kind of weird that there was no editing suggestion to my own text, which was ready. Like the moment he invited me to contribute, I had already the text almost ready, and yeah. But then he said like maybe some of the others will go through it and do little kind of edits and things like that. So I take it that there will be some editing process too.
Yeah, but my point is that you can find the formatting that Brill uses probably on their website. So they will have to do this anyway. It's not common practice not to ask authors to format. Usually our author needs to format basic things. So, I mean, even if we don't do exactly how the end product needs to be. Like we could at least, make sure all the footnotes, references, bibliography is in the same style. Like I think that's good practice, right? So formatting, I think it's about that, like just making sure that the types for the paper are standard. And I would just look on Historical Materialism's website and Brill's website and see if they don't have like a specific code for that. Yeah, it looks like it's a bit of a non-standard editorial process thus far, right? They're getting tags, they're not asking for formatting, they're probably waiting to read everything and edit afterwards. So, I mean, there might be comments later down the road. I do think it's good to know that, even if they require us to cut the text down, we have other outlets where we can use the text. Like we're planning to release all of our stuff in book form at some point. Praise and critique is always there. So, I mean, we won't kind of waste any effort in case we need to change the text too much,
Yeah, I think this is very important to restate. This is not even if things don't work out in this book, this will not be the end of this text. So now we are going to do a chapter overview. I mean, they're more like sections overview. We have about 16 sections, as you can see. We're going to try and pass through them very quickly. The important thing, I think, is to understand that these are structural points that are not to be changed, I think. They are like the backbone of our text. We may change some things here and there, but this is like what is structurally a bit more firm at this moment. And well, just so we can, I'm going to start with part one, just so we can recall the beginning of this text. Was initially proposed as a contribution that would discuss or would deal with the relation between real abstraction and world systems theory, because this is in a collection of world systems theory. Due to a series of internal discussion and also to a collective perception that, in a sense, what is like the real star, did I say world systems theory? Well, the real star, yes, a collection on real abstraction that needed one text on world systems theory. So I think that we ended up realizing collectively that there's no, that we would like just be getting into an endless battle if we tried either to show that there is a relation between world systems theory and real abstraction, or if we try to compare them in the sense that there is one that is more analytically fine-tuned than the other. So what we did, and this was a suggestion that Gabriel did based on a previous text and a previous set of differences, previous mapping of social theories, we start our analysis by dividing different theoretical strategies that we find in the political landscape in how they deal with the problem of the prescriptive issues and descriptive issues, or dominating forces, and also the desire of collective emancipation. We propose, and this is the beginning of the text, and I really like that the first word of the text is, even if it's weird, the first word is uncountable. I mean, when I first saw that, I mean, this is terrible, but then I think, okay, if this is weirdly, this is strong. I changed my mind completely. So the text starts by saying that there's an attempt to map different political theories in regards to two axes. As you can see, we did like a political compass version of it. There are 4 ways of dealing with the pair of real abstract, of domination and emancipation. We can have concrete domination, concrete emancipation, concrete domination and abstract domination, concrete emancipation and abstract domination. We can have like these 4 quadrants where we can locate social theories in a meta-political map. And the goal is not simply of organizing these different theories, but understanding the stakes that are involved in them through this mapping. So I think that something that is important is that the concept of world is something that appears in all these quadrants, and the manner in how we deal with these concepts highlight what is at stake in different theories. So, for example, just so we can have this idea, because I think concrete and abstract are vague terms if we do not specify them. This is not developed in the text. This is just something that we discussed. But we talk about concrete domination and abstract domination. A good way to see what they mean is to think that concrete relations are relations that are defined by their terms. So when we take world systems theory, for example, they are of a theory that discusses concrete domination. So you have like some countries in the core, some in the periphery. There are actual and concrete labor relations that structure the world, etc. And concrete forms of emancipation is the same issue. You have like countries in the periphery, certain social movements. You have like visible terms that deal with that are in relation with each other. But the important point is that when we talk about concrete, the terms come before the relations. When we talk about abstract, we are talking about relations that come before the terms. So, for example, the second social theory we have is abstract domination discussed by value form theories. So, for example, we are not simply discussing like the players in the social game, but the actual relations that define who the players are, for example. So this is a way that the relation precedes the terms, even determines the terms. So this is why we are calling it abstract. So value form theory would have abstract domination, and it would propose a concrete form of emancipation. So in this sense, for example, the idea is that abstract structures, in a sense, they are dominating, and the political solution is de-abstracting them. For the world system theory, as you can see, we have concrete on concrete. So that means that what is valued is not simply specific solutions, but they deal with, there's a homogeneity principle, because you have a concrete domination and you answer it with a concrete emancipation. So there's an idea of fire with fire. There's also the third quadrant that we won't be discussing in the first parts of the text, which is the Jacobinist tradition, that would oppose concrete domination with abstract emancipation. So there would be like abstract structures, reason, enlightenment. They would be a way of taking us away from concrete forms of domination, personal forms of domination. And the fourth quadrant would be ourselves, where in a sense we take abstract domination and abstract emancipation as guiding threads. So this is just like a quick overview, but what is important here, I think, is not that this is not a final say on how we view social theories. This is a hypothesis where we try and follow through what world means in these different theories, in the sense that it allows us to bypass the need to compare theories in the basis of this theory is better, this theory is worse. And we can focus on what interests us, which is actually developing the concept of world. Squad goals. Example of the fourth quadrant, that's us. We are abstract emancipation and abstract domination. We can talk about this a bit later on. But this we would be like something that like For example, you don't fight, you don't like simply go from, you have like personal forms of domination, and then the solution is like cybersyn, where you try and rationalize things and find like structures that organize these concrete instances of dominance. We have an idea of abstract domination. We are concerned with logic, but our solution is not to simply run away from abstract. We have like a multiplicity of abstractions that allow us to still deal with abstract domination in an abstract level. But I think this will be clear by the end, as Dennis said. So I think Miriam's turn now.
Hi, so do you hear me? Is that okay? Yes, okay, so I'm always a little bit nervous when I have to talk in another language in front of an audience. So I actually wrote a couple of paragraphs. So my contribution was about road systems theory. So I'm contributing to concrete emancipation and concrete domination. That's me. So first quadrant in the last slide. And so I wrote this small text to present to you what I tried to explain in my contribution. So basically, road systems theory was mainly developed by Wallenstein. It wasn't just Wallenstein, it was actually a research group that was led by Wallenstein, and it had a great influence from Brodel, which was a French historicist. And Brodel's work was mainly focused on what he called world economy. So basically, according to Brodel, a world economy is like an economic unity, an autonomous economic system that is integrated by exchange mechanisms, transportation, and commerce. So it maintains a sort of economically autonomous section of a part of the world. And this economic unity also has a specific form of organization that is organized by what he calls a center, a pole, and it's normally a city, according to Brodel, but now I think we could say nowadays it could be a state, and from this center, world economy is divided into successive zones surrounding the center. There are the areas located in the margins. So this notion also provides a geographical articulation with movements of decentralizations and subsequent centralizations. So a city that once was the center of their system can, in another moment of history, become a marginal area in the same system. That depending on where we stand in the historical process. So, and then this is Brodel contribution with road economy. And then comes Wallenstein and his research group. So Wallenstein and his group borrowed this idea of road economy in order to form road systems theory. And he maintains this organization form divided into center and marginal zones, what he calls center, semi-periphery, and periphery. And then he tries to analyze the modern road system, which is capitalism. So Wallenstein also talks about other formations like not only a modern world system, but also entire world system or mini systems. But I think he's mainly focused on the modern world system, which is capitalism beginning in modern area. So when he tries to analyze the modern world system, which is capitalism, he provides an analysis of capitalism, internal logic and functioning, especially the capitalism structures, its patterns, and how it takes place within a geographical domain and in certain historical circumstances. And that is why world systems theory is not only centered on an economic analysis, but it also extends its scope on social relations, politics, cultural and ideological features, etc. Wallenstein is going to keep the center peripheral areas as geographical axis of organization. And he's going to focus on the social division of labor, so he can explain how one area is more developed in comparison to the others. And based on a discussion towards the difference when it comes to the social division of labor, this is our main focus on the text, the social division of labor, and how it's differentiated between center and periphery. He tries to demonstrate then how the center will normally exploit and disappropriate the peripheral areas. And that is why in this slide, I try to enumerate here what it takes to form a world economy and also a world system. So it needs to cover a given geographical space, and it has to be organized towards the center, semi-periphery, and periphery. And these areas have to be interrelated, not only according to economic relations, but especially when it comes to social relations. And we try to use as an example, a good example, how he explains the social division of labor according to the center and the peripheral zones. So, and then he tries to show how there is an unbalanced relationship between core state and periphery, and this unbalanced relationship is marked by exploitation, appropriation, and accumulation of resources by the center. This is actually part of a quotation from Wallenstein that I used in the text. Yeah, I think that's it. That very synthetic, I think. So yes.
Moscardi.
Yeah, where's the, oh, okay, yeah, good. Yeah, so basically following up on Medium, perhaps this could help some people get a bit of the context and like the issues we have, our writing and everything. One of the main things which I think we managed to figure out, and that Medium also mentioned, was how do we actually establish a linkage between Sonretto and word systems theory, right? So this was a big question that we had in our minds. And of course, the easiest way to do that would be through the social division of labor. And so basically, like this, the exposition has like 4 steps. Rafael gave me a lot of help in writing it as well, and like back and forth commenting. So basically, the first thing is a very bare bones explanation of how qualifying what Sonretto has in his theory as a picture of the world that is born precisely between his concepts of real abstraction and social synthesis. And then after that, there is a comparative link, and like comparison here is a crucial word because it's something that we have been discussing. If like, are we facilitating an interface? What are we doing? But then we got to the conclusion that we are actually making a comparison. There's nothing wrong with it. And between word system theory and Sonretto, and the fact that like the grounds for that comparison are precisely that they start from the division of labor, but instead of projecting it into a certain spatial arrangement of the world, that division of labor is projected onto the social as an instance shaping the cognitive schematism behind those that are wrapped up under a particular set of social relations. And social synthesis here has an important function, after all, which is the fact that it appears as a double-layered concept, which accounts for certain general characteristics of the social, so the shaping social relations that connect different social instances. And real abstraction is the particular logical form, which is facilitated by commodity exchange and then comes to dominate production as such. So it's interesting because there is a small piece I included, I think, like Sunday on the text, which is about the way in which Sonretto also has a theory of history. And then I think that this helps also set the same ground to both of these propositions. So the fact that like you can actually have a theory of history that is focused on only abstract domination, and that theory of history looks a little bit like what Sonretto's doing. And yeah, the fourth and last thing is highlighting how the capitalist social world can be partially explained through the dynamics involved in commodity exchange. And this means that commodity exchange are not only an actual part that composes this world, but also that it is through the act of exchanging that differences between different social phenomena are bound together through a commonality that is able to reproduce this as a whole. And there's something I didn't mention about the social synthesis nexus, which is the fact that we are also trying to see this double-layered concept of social synthesis throughout the paper, and it's something that sort of justifies the interface between both. And yeah, I think that's it from my end. I'm rambling.
So the fourth part is where we start to see the position of the STP, where we can see that the strategy of the STP, at the same time, it seems to borrow elements from both these groups. In one sense, it differs from world systems theory and goes closer to value form theory, because the starting point is the objective conditions of possibility for certain goods and practices to actually circulate the system. So we take into account the idea that the world in question is not simply the sum of certain terms that connect and that have relations, but the fact that there is a certain logic that encloses this world. So this is what we take from value form theory approaches. But at the same time that we approach value form theorists, we distance ourselves from them and approach world systems theory in the sense that these logics, or to take it into a name that is closer to world systems theories, these worlds as enclosures, they're not essentially a capitalist phenomenon. Value form is a particular type of real abstraction, but every social system is structured by processes of abstractions and synthesis. So we can see here that we approach world systems theory in the sense that world systems theory tries to deal with the multiplicity of forms of linkage. There are, of course, economic aspects, but there are legal aspects, bureaucratic aspects, cultural, etc. The difference is that we're not world systems theory, so we are approaching these differences through the thought of abstraction. So in a sense, like, we try to provide a general theory of such processes, where logic constrains material reality, defining what counts and does not count, and submitting these logical units to rules for regional and global synthesis. So in a sense, we are working out this atomic logic by generalizing real abstractions. So real abstractions will not be said like there's one type of real abstractions. We will see capitalist, I was going to say socialist real abstraction. Capitalist real abstraction is one type of real abstraction. So with this, we can situate STP's theoretical developments in the fourth quadrant of our initial mapping. But I think that what is most important, and that what appears throughout the text, especially the ending of the text, is that this position allows us to avoid taking political emancipations as simply a process of undoing abstractions. And again, abstractions here in this specific sense that we are treating real abstractions. It's not a matter of simply undoing a logic of social worlds, but of re-engineering social logics. I don't know. This is something, the terms could be up for discussion, but the point is that the political emancipation is not a matter of ending with abstractions.
Yeah, I think Dennis is up now.
Yeah. So like Rafael was saying, if we start out thinking about how do we account for world systems theory using real abstraction, we run into this problem, which is like, it's not reducible, right? You cannot reduce all the phenomena that Wallerstein and Braudel are talking about back down into the commodity exchange. Or if you do, it's kind of a stretch, right, to do that. So we need to generalize, and the theory we're using here starts with the idea of the real atom, which is to say that you can divide phenomena up according to certain joints, logical connections. And if you follow this process all the way down, you will eventually hit some minimum point. And if you were to go further in this point, the phenomena would no longer have the consistency that that belongs to that world. The underlying material of that phenomena might still be there. Like, for example, if you want to talk about family dynamics, we could just look at the individual, or we could look at maybe the individual outside of the family, but then you would lose those dynamics, right? You would not be able to describe the dynamics of the family without at least two people in the family. Or in the case of psychoanalysis, you would need that one person plus an analyst, at least. So, so the basic idea here is that there is some kind of objective conditions that force a certain limit point to exist within a world. And at this limit point, we have these atoms, right? What we would call like the individuals of that world. And there are two main conditions for these atoms. One is the identificatory conditions. So that describes what is their relationship to the material world? So actual material processes, the stuff that we are calling, concrete domination. Those are actual processes occurring in the world. But there's some logic that follows them around, right? That attaches to them and conditions them. So we're very interested in that connection between the abstract and the concrete, or structural and concrete. On the other hand, we have the gluing conditions, which is once you're part of this logic, what are the conditions under which you can make a successful gluing between different atoms? And I think that this is really the key turning point in the whole theory, where we decided that we wanted to separate the transcendental of the world from the gluing of things. I don't think we've ever really explicitly said this before, but like making that division is really important. And I think actually, based on what Mascardi was just saying previously, I think this maps pretty cleanly onto the difference between real abstraction and social synthesis, right? Real abstraction is kind of like the form things need to take in order to be part of the capitalist world. But just being part of the capitalist world doesn't necessarily mean you can be glued to other things in the capitalist world. You're not automatically compatible. And to assume that is already going too far. You're kind of leaving out a certain dynamics or certain historical content that things have to happen in order to glue things. So I think this division between identificatory and gluing is really like crucial. Okay, so we can go to the next. So once we accept this division, right, at the heart of the real atom, we can then start to restrict our real atoms to go from all worlds. So worlds that are maybe physical, worlds that are natural, all the way down to worlds that are social. And the way we operate this restriction is by introducing two principles. And the first principle is of divergence, which says that logic can attain some type of independence from its underlying material substrate. So what does that mean? It means that the substrate itself can cease to exist as long as there's something that can replace it, and the logic can continue on. So the example here is if you have an ecosystem and you have a bunch of organisms in it, even if some of the organisms die, or even a large part of them die, the ecosystem itself can survive, right? So there's some kind of, there's some kind of independence there. It's something that prevents it from following the material process itself. And then the second principle is exclusion, which says that, and by the way, that example is intentionally like ecosystems are a break from the physical world, right? So you can almost have a three-tiered separation between the physical world, the natural world, and the social world. So that first principle allows us to make that jump. Then the second principle says that logic can detach itself from material entirely. So it can essentially exclude or exile certain material from participation. So here, the way the legal system can imprison an individual, or in some cases, even, you don't even get access to the legal system at all, right? Our claim here, which is maybe a bit strong, it's kind of a whole theory of nature hidden within our giant text. But our claim here is that we can actually distinguish natural from social systems by focusing on this principle of exclusion, that there's something about the logic of a social world that can, exclude people. Yeah, and also in here we have this division between, survival and life. I think we can derive that as well from this in this principle. So we say that a world that has both principles is social. And then if we have a third principle, which is that multiple logics can be attached to the same material, we have what are called complex atoms in a multi-layered social world. Yeah, so yeah, and then we can go on to the next thing. So once we have this idea of complex atoms, so remember they're the smallest parts of the world that still make sense with that logic. We can start to talk about, world systems theory again. We can start to build world system theory from scratch using this framework. So we identified 3 logical modes corresponding to Karatani's, right? Actually, Karatani adds the 4th mode here, but we didn't put that here. So that's also something we've been discussing in the group. But we have A, B, and C. And we say that there's actually a very material difference between these 3 types of logics. And we use the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction to distinguish them. So classical logic holds both laws. Mode A allows for contradictory statements. So a statement and its complement are both, or its negation can both hold in a local way in mode A. So we can think of something like a boundary between one community and another community. In that boundary, it's possible that certain statements can be both true and false, right? It doesn't have to be a community. It can be between 2 people. It can be some other type of boundary, but there's some condition there, right? And then for mode C, we suspend excluded middle. So that means there can be statements which are neither true or false, and those statements are kind of open to negotiation. And so that this idea of like bargaining, of finding the right price for a commodity, that would be kind of located in this in-between space. Yeah, so once we have the 3 modes, we can then define how they interact with each other. So they all belong to the same world, right? Because we have a multiplicity principle. So they all map to some material substrate. There has to be a material process in the world that somehow holds or carries these logics around. We created this theory of how they all interact, and we call it the scaffolding logic. And then there's different operations that can happen. So for example, to actually have employment, you can't just stay in mode C. You have to, pay your taxes. You need to have a contract, and that goes through mode B, for example. So the phenomena of employment is not a single mode thing. It relies on multiple things, right? So it's scaffolded in that sense. So if we buy this argument that most of the phenomena that appear in the social world are actually composites of these 3 logics, If we buy that argument, then we also can ask the question of when one logic becomes more important than the other ones. When one logic can somehow supplement or glue together parts of the world when others fail. So an example of this would be, you know, in a social space where you know, social institutions are failing, like the state institutions are not there, and there's no communal ties between people. If you can, you know, reach for your wallet to solve most of your problems, then that means mode C would be the dominant logic, right? It can somehow support things even when the other ones fail to some extent, right? So this would be a kind of a hand-wavy definition of a dominant logic. And I think it's something that we are trying to, you know, focus on later after this text to understand when exactly something becomes dominant. When is that, you know, what is the precise conditions for that? I think, yeah, this is the last slide for me, which is about alignment and misalignment. Yeah. So, okay, I'm glad someone put this picture here. Yeah, that kind of summarizes everything. Yeah, so the last property we wanted to talk about here is alignment and misalignment of layers. So when multiple atoms attach to the same material, there is this notion that they align when there are no edges. There's no part of the material process that is in some of the logics, but not in the other ones, right? And I think the simplest example is just think about an individual who can be a citizen, a family member, and have property, right? So in that sense, there's no, if you have all three of those, you have no edges because all parts of you are accounted for, right? Your physical body is protected by the law. You are part of the family, right? You have, you know, kinship relations, and you can own property. So a very clear delineation. It gets fuzzier when we talk about aggregates of individuals, like communities, right? We say it's misaligned when there's parts of the body that are not covered by a given logic. So even an individual, if you have no property at all, then, you know, it's misaligned because even though you have the capacity to be a property owner, you know, if you don't actually have property, then you can't actually participate in the market. And then, yeah, the other example is like, yeah, you have a community of undocumented migrant workers. So you might have some shared property that you've collected together, but you have to hide from the state. So again, not all the modes are hitting the same sets of people, right? There's certain groups of people that are excluded from different things. And this actually goes back to the principle of exclusion. The fact that we have the fact that social worlds can exclude material processes and material individuals, that's what allows us to find these edges where things don't line up. So yeah, if you look at this picture here, you can kind of see how we restricted our theory. We started with the idea of a world and its atoms, and then we have these two types of conditions of the atoms. If we have them both, we can then start to glue them together to build phenomena. And the types of phenomena we care about are complex and social. So we need to hold these three principles. And then once we do that successfully, then we have a theory that we can start to account for very complex phenomena, like phenomena where there's multiple logics, where one logic can be dominant and others can be subdominant, where you can have these layer operations, which they're in the text, but it's basically the scaffolding logic. And then we can talk about alignment and misalignment.
Okay, so once we get there, we pretty much, everything that follows in the text is built with that machinery that then is presented, right? Which is situated in the context of the quadrants that Rafael, Miriam, and Moscardi presented. So it's really building up kind of one point after the other. The first thing we do is to say, okay, we explain this very general idea of social atoms, that they have gluing conditions, that they can be aligned or misaligned in their scaffoldings of multiple logics. But then we want to derive concepts that start looking like concepts you find in world systems theory, for example, because we're saying we want to also inherit things from their type of analysis, right? So the first thing we thought of is, okay, but how do we restrict our general theory of atoms, which can, go in every direction, to speaking about what constitutes a social space? So parts of the world that are spatially connected. So we thought of defining it in the following way, continuing what Dennis said in terms of restrictions. So theory of worlds, theory of social worlds with their multiple logics, and then we restrict it further by saying, let's only look at compositions that are reversible, meaning where localization, compatibility, and order, which are the three gluing conditions we have, are symmetric. So if I say that, A is glued to B, and I can go from A to B, that also implies I can go back from B to A. So it's reversible. You can take any path between these parts, right? And that will give us a basic definition of what it means to be a spatial part of the world. Hegel would call this indifferent self-externality, right? Things are not oriented. They don't have inner movement. They can go, you can go there and you can come back, right? What we do then is to show that with that basic definition, we can recuperate everything Dennis said about different modes with different logics, with scaffoldings, and they correspond now to a rich typology of social space. We can talk about finity social space, because we're going to look at reversible gluings with the mode A, which is a paraconsistent topology, as the dominant one. And we're going to find that this corresponds very well to the relations between interior, exterior, inside and outside in societies governed by mode A, where you'll find crazy things, like, for example, what Lévi-Strauss studies when he writes on the dual organizations exist. So it's a very famous text where he studies the tribe of Winnebago, where people live in a certain region, and two halves of the tribe describe the whole in different ways. So one half of the tribe thinks the tribe is divided in the middle in two sections. The other half of the tribe thinks it's divided in concentric circles. The logic you need to divide space in a way that it appears socially like that to you, depending on where you are, the complement of a half is not really the complement. It looks at the world in a different way and so on. It's precisely the type of topology that our theory of social space of mode A suggests. Then we show that the same is valid for mode B, and the sort of regular complements for what's going on? Regular complements for in classical logic, class negation, so on. They correspond very well to, let's say, the state space. This is something Henri Lefebvre used to study, and how the state is kind of embedded in the logic of walls, borders, and the challenges you need to solve to create a space ruled by the state. They are isomorphic to the challenges of classical logic being consistent, because you need to create residualist complements where either something belongs or it doesn't. Otherwise, you can't alienate property, right? So if I can't say where land ends and where someone else's property starts, how can I say who owns it, right? So there's something that connects classical logic and the logic of property space and all. And then we do the same for intuitionistic negation, open sets, and the logic of value, which I think is really good because it's very counterintuitive for people who only see capital from the consumer side, where commodities are just equivalent and space is very hygienic and so on, to realize that the factory floor is actually a very plastic, fuzzy space where every metric can be reconsidered, resolutions can be reconsidered. You can, when you're starting production and the competition is very low, if you take 1 meter to get to another part of a factory line, or 50 centimeters, that doesn't matter. But with time and competition, it might matter. And then the whole resolution of the factory floor changes, right? So intuitionistic space is very good to kind of picture that the open set topology, which is kind of regular topology anyway. So we derive the concept of social space, and we show that we can bring up all those different kind of differentiations we can do with the different modes, and they do correspond to the actual structure of space in societies ruled by these different logics, which is already a pretty cool find. Could you move to the next one, Rafa? Yeah, so then we added twist, which is to say, let's now recuperate the idea of scaffoldings, right? And the idea that Dennis mentioned between either what we call, we're in doubt if we call aligned or misaligned, because then it makes it look like what happens in the periphery is missing something that happens in the center. But the theory in itself actually shows that what happens in peripheral situations is the more general. There are more ways in which things can be misaligned than ways in which they can be aligned. So actually the center homogeneous space or logic is the special case of our general logic, which is misaligned most of the time. So Rafael suggested that we call this nested versus spread out rather than aligned, misaligned, because spread out doesn't look like it's missing something, right? But in any case, once we have the concept of social space, what we do next is to ask, what about scaffoldings that are aligned in social space and scaffoldings which are misaligned or spread out? And what we get is a way to define the difference between center and periphery, which is purely logical. We can say that parts of space where atoms are mostly nested, in the sense of what Dennis was talking about, the identity conditions for one logic already give you relevant parts for the other logics. If I say you are a citizen, I'm already identifying a worker, already identifying a family member, right? All the things nest together. So places in the world where the three logics are aligned or nested, and most atoms are like that, most parts of the world are that we would call a central region. And places where the logics are more spread out and atoms don't align with each other, we would call peripheral zones. But the map that we are creating is not a geographical map or anything like this. It's a logical map. So you can have central regions with peripheral zones in their small kind of geographical scope. Then you zoom out and majoritarily it was a central area, but with peripheral areas. And then you have a new periphery of that center. So you can create like scale the resolutions of center and periphery and actually spread this everywhere. And you're not tied to a geographical idea that if something is far, it needs to be periphery. If it's close, it needs to be center, even though the two things do align. Because, if you're near a strativist source where you're taking matter out of the land, to put it into a production process, mode B will be separate from mode C because you need to turn things into property before they can be commodified. So they will be misaligned. The source of fictive commodities, we can already claim as a logical kind of theorem that the closer you are to the source of fictive commodities, the more certain you'll have misaligned atoms. You can know that for sure. So it makes sense that the properties we assign to peripheries, overexploitation, extractivism, so on, they tend to have more misaligned atoms as well. So it matches with the regular concept, but it's not based on the terms, it's based on the relations, right? So it's an advance. So after that, we go to social time, and now, it is also compatible with the idea that peripheral spaces are the truth of the core, in the sense that they give you the general theory, out of which core properties are a special case, right? So I find that to be very cool. Then we can define social time, and we can derive time by, again, restricting our general theory of atoms only to irreversible gluings. So compositions where I can go from A to B in terms of localization, compatibility, and order, but I cannot come back. There's no symmetry there, right? This is something similar to what Anna introduced in one of her comments in the original draft of the text concerning Rovelli's theory of time as a derived property in a kind of fundamental physical sense where time is not like essential. So in our theory, we follow Hegel and Rovelli in the idea that time is actually derived from a more primitively spatialized theory. So we will say that we're looking at temporal compositions when we're looking at irreversible gluings. And again, our theory of the typology and the scaffoldings will work. So we can talk about different temporalities of mode A. And you can see that because we're not just interested, time for us is not just a kind of, it's not just a matter of the resolution. Is it a duration? Is it an instant? It's not just the size of the interval that changes. It's also how intervals are glued. So we can show that intervals of time being glued by paraconsistent rules, you might find that the past is still present in the present. And you might find that the future is present in the present. And so what we usually call circular time, or the idea that the past or ancestry is still relevant and decisions you take today set the meaning of events of the past, all those things are possible to explain as part of the way mode A sociality glues temporal compositions. We can explain why mode B time sounds like intervals that are pure cuts, and that you can only measure time by creating dates, calendars, divisions that have no residue in that sense of before and after, which are just stark contrasts, right? In mode C temporality, it has that very kind of recognizable aspect of time in capitalism, where you're constantly redefining and intensifying what fits in an instant and where it actually ends, because you're negotiating with the logic of actions in production, turnover time of things. So how things compete in the market and in organic composition defines what counts as the size of a relevant interval, when you get those two things connected to one another. So again, we can derive a very robust idea of what social time means, right? For the different modes. But after we do that, we basically came up with a theory of social space-time, because we can now show that processes, well, they will be both things. They are in time and space always at the same time. That kind of gives us an idea of what a social object is like, right? What we then do is to ask questions about what are the limits of this, right? What is not a social world, and how far can these little logical machines go in guaranteeing the social synthesis of a space? And what is very cool is that we realize that this problem is very much like the problem of closure for systems, logical systems, number systems, and things like this, so group theory and so on. The idea that you want to know if, given some domain and some operation, if the product of the operation on the domain still belongs to that domain or not. That's what we're calling world closure. And what we realize is that, well, basically what we're asking is, what are the properties of that closure given the logic that rules that given world, right? So that whole debate we were having, the things we were studying on what are paraconsistent topos, what are classical Boolean toposes, what are intuitionistic or heightened algebras and so on. Those things came back here and gave us some really cool insights to the idea that, well, if you look at how closures are operated in a paraconsistent structure, what you will get is that globally they are complete. So it's not hard to create, let's say, a closed set of everything, but locally they are inconsistent because of that boundary thing that Dennis was talking about. When I get this basic unit and I ask about its complement, I might get a pseudo complement, which means that there is something which is neither here nor there. It's kind of a contradiction. So you get local inconsistencies. And if you think about this, societies ruled by mode A, they do tend to have this structure. This global completeness is what we call a cosmos. The idea that the universe is closed and everything fits there. And the idea of local inconsistency, it's the amazing fact that even though you live in a cosmos, meeting one person can change everything, right? The meeting of a stranger can put into question everything. You don't know who is who. Like the classic Eduardo Viveiro's example of you meet, an animal in the forest and you don't know if they are the animal or you. Everything is put into question locally and it can be turned around, but globally it's kind of settled in that way, right? Well, that property follows from everything we said this far, which is crazy. Then the second thing is we realize that when you look at mode B societies, I think this is actually an un-Hegelian point. Hegel associates history with states, but he doesn't make it clear he's talking about the modern state very much, right? It's just state theory. Like the appearance of the state allows for reflection, and this has to do with kind of a people being in history. But the concept of history in great empires has nothing to do with the Hegelian concept, which is a self-moving negation. If you look at the way history is kind of taught in most big empires in history, like Aztec Empire, Chinese dynasties, and so on, it's very much a hierarchical concept of eras, dynasties. They're kind of closed at the bottom and at the top. And this is always a hard thing that you need to work very hard to create, this minimal consistency and also kind of hierarchical structure to kind of tame that space and call it closed. So you need a bunch of people writing, scribes, archivists, bureaucrats to try to keep these things together. And it's both moving and static at the same time. It's not the Hegelian theory, right? And again, if you look at just, this is the most common, like the dramas of striving for consistency and completeness in classic logic and systems with classic logic, you will get the sort of underlying formal drama that fits with this, right? So I think it's another great find to end a certain Eurocentric conception that divides the world between cyclical and linear time, cosmic versus historical time, when most states in the world don't have neither of the two. Like, of course, they will have cosmic, kind of cosmological, pagan, whatever visions, because they are built of communities, and communities tend to keep some mode A closure alive. But the actual structure, right, of this kind of mono blockage with hierarchies and statuses, it actually follows its own separate logic. And then the third, which we can see, is exactly how things are described in logics of worlds. For example, intuitionistic or mode C types of closure, they tend to be locally consistent, but globally incomplete, right? It's kind of, it leaves open the same way. I find it beautiful to think that mode A, its otherness appears at the local level, right? A stranger appears and you need to solve that inconsistency. Mode C, it's the other in terms of an other system. It's an other moment in time. So it's the otherness in space and time at the global level that puts the system into question. And you need to make a solution to that. But we have a name, or many names, for a global openness, which is history as an open thing, the need for development, the need for growth, and so on and so forth. So it's crazy that it actually corresponds to the three modes, the three logics, also the different types of closure we can get for each world. And we decided to call that closure history, rather than just history is a type of time. History has more to do with what happens at the infinity of a system, right? At the level of how it brings space and time together at the point of infinity, if you will, rather than, it's just like long time, right? So we're associating history with closure. You can move to the next one. So again, bringing back the theory of the scaffolding and restricting ourselves just to capitalist society. So mode C, right? We can ask the following question. Say you have a capitalist system which needs to generate new atoms, right? To keep integrating things in space when Elon Musk goes to Mars, generating things in time as the system develops and produces new situations. What type of atoms will guarantee the gluing? And just to give a brief example of how you can differentiate the generation of two atoms, think that you have a kid and he's now a little teenager who's going to go about in the world, and you need to give him advice about life. If you lived in a more aligned place or a more nested place, that means that you can address all constraints that organize your life at once by giving specific general rules. Behave well, trust, the law, don't treat people badly, and so on and so forth. That kind of solves it. Like a few kind of suggestions and bits of wisdom cover 12 rules of life. With Jordan Peterson, you can find your way around, right? If you lived in a misaligned or more spread out place, you'll have to say like, you know, be a good person, but don't trust the cops, but only trust the cops in this situation, but also try to be a good worker, but at the same time, don't work too much, but at the same time, you're obliged to give much more descriptions in order to address the constraints that people will meet. So when you know, those two types of situations, you're generating new constraints, you're passing along rules, some of them more nested, some of them are more spread out. So in the case of a capitalist system, which type of rules are you propagating if you want to glue these new things into the world? Well, if the best way to glue things is by propagating nested rules, aligned rules, then we live in a modernizing history, because you are propagating rules that function in the center. Remember, our definition of center is based on nested atoms, right? So you will increase the amount of nested atoms, and this will guarantee the closure or the consistency, right? If you live in a peripherizing world, where you need to adequate people to a different form in order to gain consistency, you'll have to provide them more spread out rules so that they need to propagate those rules if they want to glue things. You're not providing chaos. You're not creating disorder. Order has the form of spread out atoms. That's something else. So we can give a definition of peripherization as a thesis, as the thesis that under certain conditions, the capitalist world glues its future to guarantee its closure by needing to propagate spread out atoms. So we can give a logical definition of that. And the fact that it's logical is very good because it totally disentangles periphery from the idea of chaos, periphery from the idea that it's more concrete. So it's a defetishization of the periphery, like complete defetishization. Peripheral form is an abstract form for connecting parts of capitalist world. Not only that, but it's the more general form than the nested form, right? Then there are only 2 points to conclude. The first one is to drive home that point by connecting with our other text, the working through political organization, because then we say, okay, what does the theory of peripherization imply for the concept of class? So we introduce a distinction between class composition and class formation. This is actually a well-known distinction, but we give it our own take, which is class composition is to look at those parts of social reality that capital interacts with it as a class. So it's not that we are abstracting by convention and calling all these people the same because we want to see them as the same. It's what does capital see as the same? And it's true, capital does interact with a certain sector of the working class as if it's a class, and it requires that group to be treated as a group, and it makes indistinct some traits of these people in order to reproduce itself. Class formation has more to do with how that group or that abstraction that capital itself creates is projected into community and state logic, which allows us to relate with it as a class, right? So it's formed for social reality, for people to engage with each other, create community, create affinity, and so on, based on a class character. And the thesis of peripherization says that under peripheral situations, it is very much possible that class composition blocks class formation, because the way capital relates to a certain group of people, when projected to the other layers, doesn't project to the same communities, the same values, the same place with regards to the law. So if I turn to somebody who is, a hard, honest worker living in a small, low middle class, 1-bedroom apartment, and I tell him he looks more like a drug trafficker in terms of the place he is in a supply chain and exploited chain of labor, than with his neighbor who is actually, a bit better off than him and so on, he will despise me completely. But from the standpoint of capital, those two people might be much closer, right? So formation and composition don't match. And this is the kickstart for us to understand why, peripheral forms require us not to assume that there is a common ground between sectors of the working class. That doesn't mean there is no class. There is a working class. There is a class that you can define based on people who sell their labor power, blah, 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 blah. But it doesn't project into social groups that will struggle for the same interests. So that's why we need the theory of what we were previously calling, perhaps we can change it, abstract emancipation. Because you need first a theory that considers that there are multiple mediations shaping the social space, basically a theory of domination that can account for, I think it totally subsumes the clause of it text. But we need to be able to look at the social space and recognize, know how to deal with the difference between composition and class formation. And second, how that is focused on building these mediations, constructing these common grounds, rather than assuming they will be there by logical necessity, right? So that kind of sets up the stage for the last part, which is when we finally go back to the original schema and just contrast our own position in the fourth quadrant to the third quadrant, which we didn't speak of yet, right? So the idea is that we now look at this third quadrant. What is a theory that has concrete or conjunctural domination and structural emancipation or abstract emancipation? And there are very different theories that have this structure. But generally what they have in common is that they will define the situation we are in as almost like a continuation of feudalism, of direct violence, of personal violence, and so on. And they will praise mediations for releasing us from the personal and going towards the impersonal, from releasing us from, particular and going to the universal. There is a qualitative evaluation of the abstract versus a qualitative evaluation of the concrete. So even though neo-Jacobinism, which is, let's say, kind of praise of enlightenment as the basis of contemporary politics, the Enlightenment was trying to bring about solid impersonal institutions. Law is a first step in like mediations that don't differentiate between people. We're continuing that. Jacobinists have this idea. Accelerationists, that science and technology are pointing us away from this particular description of things, or even natural description of things, so we can move towards a plurality of mediations and a plurality of approaches to the world. But again, technology and these increased mediations are helping us to move away from the concrete in that sense. But autonomists and kind of Negrian multitude-like thinkers also have that idea that the general intellect, social creativity, all these things are moving us away from a sort of particular embedding or individual particular kind of take on things, right? So that's kind of that's how the abstract gains this very specific quality, because it's being pitted or contrasted to the concrete. But we don't have the concrete on the other side. We don't think we're fleeing from terms and moving to relations. We're moving from certain relations to other types of relations, right? So in contrast to this kind of third quadrant, STP's theory of abstract emancipation, or whatever we want to call it, cannot be contrasted to the quality or substance of domination. It can only distinguish itself by the type of forms it creates and composes, because we cannot count on any substantial difference. Like there's nothing metaphysically different between capitalism and socialism. It's all made of the same stuff. Like you cannot have these substantial differences between concrete and abstract, between this is made of this and that's made of that to make the distinctions. You need to actually build things different, right? So even though we can only distinguish between the forms, the specific forms, because everything is made of the same type of thing. However, this allows us to break from a certain concept of history, which even when it's not teleological, it's kind of implied in the third quadrant, which is things that take us from the concrete to the abstract. Things that take us from either the immediate to the mediate, or from the individual to the collective, and always like with this qualitative dimension, right? And we can start asking a different question, which is, given new forms, given new ways of composing parts of the world, what will history look like in such socialist world? So we can add the prescription, which is crazy, that the logic of history, the way the world will be closed in a socialist society, will be a new thing. So the experience of history will be a new experience of history, which is not mode A, B, or C. It will be something we don't know what it is, right? So in that sense, very specific sense, we can both have a historical theory like the first quadrant, focus on abstractions and forms like the second quadrant, be praiseworthy of developing mediations and constructing things like the third quadrant, but we are not committed to a particular concept of history that is the background, that is going to lead us somewhere and we can just follow it, whatever it is. We can actually ask what will be the history after we constructed the stuff we're constructing, because it won't be able to be neither the closed cosmos, nor the passage of dynasties, nor open historical progress. So we can start asking what will be the properties of something like that. And that actually gives concrete meaning to the idea that you can make history, right? Because history is the product of organization in non-trivial ways. So that's the very kind of basic claim we can make by the end of this paper. And that's the end of it.
Folks, I think we should do a 10-minute break. So we can take a breather. What do you guys think? 5 or 10?
Yeah, I can do 5 if you guys are okay.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, so we'll be back 1952 on real time. So 5 minutes, everyone. So 5 minutes have passed.
Dennis, I just wanted to bring up something because I think that the principle of exclusion, the way you formulate it, it's too general, because excluding things in the sense of not counting them or rendering them indifferent or rendering them inexistent, right? It's a very general thing. You don't need to like macro scale physical systems. They do make, you know, small scale variations irrelevant in a certain sense, right? So it's very general. So exclusion in the sense that not everything that could make a difference in support makes a difference is very, I think it's built into the atomic logic as such. I think you mean something more specific, but the way we discussed it today made me a bit uncertain if that specific thing is clear. Like, for example, I say something like the fact that, you know, you exclude inside the social world sounds more relevant than you exclude to the outside, or to just make it indifferent because you can, you know, create these negations inside of it. I'm not sure. So just that I feel like the idea of survival separated from living, and more generally, which I think is like a generalization of division of labor, the idea that you have social processes when specific particular processes are glued to one another, not in the ecosystematic sense of, you know, the purpose of that gluing is to make everyone survive. You can diverge in that sense. You're gluing so that the logic survives, even if the parts don't, right? So killing people can keep the system alive. It is not just that they are being left outside, right? So I don't know, there's something to it that I feel like we could make more precise, perhaps.
Yeah, the example I was thinking about here is like, you know, there's a theory about apoptosis or cell death, which is a common theory of aging. This idea like there's nothing inherently that makes cells die out to be replaced. There's some kind of programming that's built into them, and then you can see that at a larger scale as well, like something about the lifespan of the individual in a species is beneficial, right? It's beneficial that you don't live forever for the species, because then your body doesn't accumulate mutations and you don't pass them on further. So in that sense, living systems already have this, like what you're saying. So I wanted something a bit stronger to isolate this, like, because overall what we're trying to say is like social systems are more autonomous in some sense, right? But yeah, it's hard to say what exactly is the property. Like I get this thing survival versus life, but that seems circular because it's defining the difference between social and living in terms of the difference between it's already there, and the difference between survival and life. Okay.
Yeah, but I agree. It's not, I think in the revision we can add better ideas. My impression is just that, you know, the insight that you have in the division of labor, which I think we can follow up on, is just that, you know, even in a cooperative social system, which is not even human, like, or a hierarchical one, which is not even human, like ants in a colony, it's when we divide them in terms of soldier ants, scouting ants, and things like this, we're not really dividing the way we divide ecosystems in terms of, you know, the reproduction of this animal is interdependent of the reproduction of that animal. The interdependence of the survival of species, you know, forming ecosystems is different from the way you're distributing what counts and what doesn't and how it counts when you make that distinctions between ants. Because being a soldier is not going to make it survive. It's going to make the whole work. And it's based on that whole that you're describing this kind of more abstract functions, right? So for example, in the division of labor, you get that sort of sense where the simplest way is that you divide a process that the total of the process makes us all survive. I will cut down the tree, you take the fruits, somebody boils them and we eat, right? None of the activities make me survive. If I just do my thing, survival is not guaranteed, it's guaranteed by the whole, right? So that idea of division of labor, and especially when you generalize it to see societies where the division of labor can be to the point where it really doesn't guarantee your survival. It just guarantees the aggregate survival, right? So that distinction between processes you do and what maintains you in the world, right? That's what I was thinking of, like, and then that's why survival and life are made more distinct, because in ecosystems, it is the process of you surviving, like in a region, either as a species or as a particular individual, that is tying you to the whole, right? So it's cutting at the joints of survival, the ecosystem. Like, it's not just like some random activity some creature is doing for a random purpose that is glued to the others. No, that activity is part of its own survival, right? Whereas here we can have like small activities that become autonomized, that have no purpose in surviving. They are needed for the survival of the whole, out of which then you survive, right?
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. So like, there's the division of labor in like the cells in your body, for example. The cells do different things, right? But that's all functional towards the purpose of surviving. But you're saying if we have division of labor where the parts are not functional and the function appears almost like as an accident after the gluing has happened, they weren't glued because they were keeping us alive. They were glued by some other reason, because it was fun, because it was something to pass the time. But in the end, that becomes the condition of survival in a second step. Then it's social.
Yeah, like you would have to look at an aggregate to find the structure that guarantees survival. You cannot look at the parts and then build on multiple survival systems to get to the whole, right? Which then has some properties which can change, but those properties don't need to stay the same to guarantee the survival of the parts, right? So you can adapt. That's why adaptation is kind of open on the aggregate side in this way. Like, whereas in our case, survival goes through the gluing, and the actual parts might not guarantee survival on their own, right? You're promised the slice of the cake after the cake was made, but you only contribute with a small bit of it, right? So in a certain sense, survival is first a property of the whole, and then it trickles down to the parts, because it's not guaranteed that, the activity you know how to do sometimes, if you're removed from the rest of the world, it doesn't guarantee anything. I tie shoes, that's my job. Yeah, good luck, man. Surviving anywhere, It only works because you're paid for it, and the shoes you tied are connected with the shoemaker, connected to the consumer, blah, blah, blah. The money comes in your hand, you buy something somebody else did, right? So that distributed survival would be the social characteristic that we can generalize and treat in the atomic gluing social synthetic sense, rather than by having a strong concept of labor that's the basis of everything, right? So don't need an ontology of labor to be able to realize that we're associating survival first to the gluing and then trickling down to the parts, to the point that you would say, I cannot stop tying shoes. That's how I survive. Like, that's a crazy abstract statement. Like, No, dude, nothing happens when you tie shoes. But yes, it's true at the same time. That's how you survive, right? So that would be a sociality, right? So it's there with what you said, but I think it clarifies the divergence, right? I'm not sure if it clarifies it. I'm assuming it does.
I think there's a really precise solution for this that is something that we've actually worked on. The exact thing that you're talking about, isn't that precisely what integrated information theory measures, right? And like that's a lot of why like it's brought in that Apolito essay, because like it's specifically talking about how, you know, if you're measuring integrated information, you're measuring, I mean, it's similar to like division of labor, right? You're measuring how like, you know, all of the parts depend on the whole in order to function. And I mean, this actually also connects to like, if you're talking about it as a theory of consciousness, like I feel like that's also really helpful to thinking about exclusion, because like consciousness also kind of functions through exclusion, right? I think it actually connects a whole bunch of different themes. And it's also something that can be pursued, I think, on a more sort of rigorous, like, you know, formal way. And I mean, allows for an interesting connection to like some of the ideas that are like developed in that Apolito paper.
Yeah, but I think that this property you're mentioning, that, you know, parts depend on each other, the measure of interdependence of parts, you can have that in physical systems or, you know, non-living, non-social systems. You would need to define what is interdependent. Like, what is the property, right, that you're saying is interdependent, and then that makes it social. Whereas when it's interdependent in other contexts, and it's not optimizing for that property, then we wouldn't call it social, right? So
Well,
I think it totally fits, but
yeah, I mean, I think it would have to be like worked out in more detail in terms of like what the literature on IIT kind of goes into for this, but it is sort of specifically designed to account, you know, for consciousness rather than for any given physical system that wouldn't be conscious. Like it's trying to, you know, develop a way of talking about what we understand intuitively as conscious. I think it can be adapted like as like, you know, the cybernetic communism paper kind of tried to first develop, like it can be adapted to talk about social systems too, right? But I mean, I think it would entail like engaging more closely with the literature on like how they try to limit it to like actually measuring consciousness rather than just measuring like any kind of interconnectedness.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the work Renzo has been doing on this and the things that we talk about, I don't know. Dennis is writing this section. If you think IIT helps, my impression is just that it's either, I mean, they're going through the struggle right now. It's a different theory. I think we can't talk about interconnectedness and the level of interconnectedness in the atomic sense that we've been developing, but it wouldn't clarify what is being very interconnected can be like thermostats with a sensor can be interconnected. Like, and in IIT, they have, it has a non-zero phi, right? Which is the measure of consciousness. It's like the ongoing joke on the definition they have of consciousness right now, that it's applied to thermostats and things like that. That's why it has kind of a panpsychism theory, where even inorganic things have consciousness, but we wouldn't say they're either alive or socially organized. So I think it's kind of in Portuguese we say a vespero, like the house of bees is like a stingy situation. You know, like there are too many things to be sorted out there to clarify. It would lead us to a pickle. Exactly. It's much less dangerous than a can of worms. It's a can of worms because it's still being worked out. So we would be explaining something complicated to something complicated. I have the impression that they are like going to something, because we need to be quick with this, right? It could be a good footnote on, you know, interesting developments on interconnectedness are found in IIT, but I don't think they are happy with how they define consciousness and the limits of it, of what is and what is not. So moving from consciousness to social, which is a different thing, it would be a second can of, we would be to mix 2 cans of worms in a plate, and then do like this and add Parmesan cheese.
Right. I think I understand now. But yeah, I guess it would
Worms and pickles, yeah.
I guess it would be interesting to see if there could be kind of like a simpler way or like a way to measure it. I guess that would be more a development out of the kind of atomic logic framework. But I think it's sort of at least worth like bookmarking for later that this is also like I think a helpful way to look at the problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say, I like this idea of using IIT. I think it's promising. I think also I want whatever thing we come up with should have some impact on the rest of the text and not just be, I don't want to just have a theory of nature and a theory of the social just to have it there. It should somehow make an impact on the social space-time part, right? So whatever we decide is like the important property we want to highlight in the later part of the text, I think that should be reflected in the principle earlier on. And I think that's why exclusion seems interesting, because in order for misalignment to occur in the first place, you need some processes to belong to some logics, but not others. So you need some mechanism to distribute the logics unevenly across the material processes, right? So I thought principle of exclusion is a nice way to bring that back to the, like saying like the whole possibility of that to happen is built into our definition of the social. But I do see, yeah, there's cases where that doesn't make any sense and it's kind of a blurry line. But yeah, but I think the criteria should be that it connects with the other phenomena we're identifying later in the text.
Yeah, like my proposal of something, I think I totally agree with you, but like what, just to throw it out there, see what you guys think. I would substitute principle of exclusion for something like downward survival, which means that you can only see if a process helps somebody, a living system, to remain in life by going through the mediations. If you look at it, you don't see it, right? So that's a difference between saying this bird feeding off the mouth of a shark, it's feeding off a feeding system. So I can look at the little fish in the mouth of the shark, and I can look at the shark, and I'm looking at surviving systems at the level of the parts. And then I can look at the surviving of the ecosystem as well. Whereas when I look at an artist like smashing a guitar, somebody tying shoes, somebody, you know, painting automobile parts, and I say these people are surviving, I cannot tell from those actions. Only if I go upwards towards a mediated system and then downwards back to their actions, right? And the ants as well, I cannot tell they are soldiers and that by being a soldier they are surviving, because it's not a living system when I look down, right? There's something of, yeah, downwards, it is when the social reproduction is not in the parts, it's mediated by the whole, right? So it actually frees up people from having to worry about leaving. That's why you cannot define you know, the goal of social life for people to reproduce themselves, which is an argument that a lot of conservatives use, you know, in sexual politics. Because no, the principle of society is that you are allowed to only survive through the whole and no longer through the part. So it's a divergence at the level of reproduction, right? You only reproduce as a part if the whole reproduces itself, right? That contains the principle of exclusion, because to reproduce the whole, you might have to not reproduce the parts, some of the parts, but in killing parts, you're not undoing a bio orientation, you're actually doing it. So that's why necropolitics and biopolitics are the same at infinity, right? To kill is to live. So that only possible in a social system. Whereas if you kill off a whole species in a ecosystem, you killed off a whole species. That's what you did. You didn't reproduce anything. So I think that there's something about downward syntheses, the idea that the specific property of survival which is usually connected first to the particular and then to the universal. In the cases of social systems, it goes downwards, it trickles down rather than go upwards, right? You don't need to have living systems as the basis, the joints of your atoms. You can have like parts that don't guarantee life as the part, right? It's just how they're connected in the whole that guarantees ultimately that things do go on living. Yeah, top-down survival, downward synthesis, like that's the principle I would look for, because I think what it does bring to the table that we need in the text is forcing people to realize that looking at things socially means not to look at what things are, the terms, but look at the relations between them, right? Principle of aggression, that's it. Right, so you do a lot of things collectively, well, but that might not be social. It's not glued to the rest of things in such a way that it's connected to the system of downward reproduction, right? Or there's a sole activity, a guy pressing a button in a computer. That can be a social activity because it's glued as that part to that downward surviving system, right? And then you can clearly see that money, status, connections, they are making the gluing and guaranteeing the reproduction of the living system, not the actual thing. So I think that underlying there's also a need to find something like that that separates the living creature's reproduction from this downward reproduction, because this frees up for arguments that don't essentialize human reproduction, which is something that's important for us to keep politically, I think.
Just so I can see if I understand this, the point is that reproduction is not established locally. It only is established through the connection of a local part to a whole that reproduces itself. So it's participation in a sense.
So you're asking, is this plate? You're like a guy with a butterfly. Is this participation?
No, I mean, there's a simple word out there. Come on.
I think Anna said it all. It's called social reproduction, like literally. Reproduction through the social.
Yeah. But I was thinking about the aspect of just honing down on the principle, and that's why I actually said not, and I didn't suggest participation or even aggression.
True.
I was thinking of aggression, which is this weird Whiteheadian solution to think about what participation is from the point of view of truths. So in a sense that it's just like the other way from participation. So, but it was just a suggestion, but I just wanted to understand if because it does make a lot more sense if we think. And I do think that from that point of view, it really frees up the social from conservative notions.
Yeah, and you also can understand, like, I mean, I don't think it's for this paper, but it sets up the stage for understanding why human bodies are never fully integrated. Because as you're being socialized, the fact that you can be split into parts that don't make up a living whole is relevant for social reality, right? The fact that you can separate your hand from the rest of your body and that's what guarantees survival, and not what you do with your whole body, right? That's useful. So keeping a level of plasticity is actually socially guaranteed, right? Rather than that being integrated and so on. So that kind of the social mediation between the bodies and the organs in a way, right? You exist, and that contributes to the whole, but then the whole tells you how it's going to divide you. Pretty much we're saying the chapter on manufacturing in Marx is actually a ulterior sociality hidden.
Yeah. I was actually thinking, because I was talking with Moscar earlier today. I think the head in hand problem has also been solved just a minor, another marginal conclusion that we can derive from this paper.
Yeah, so I don't know. I like social reproduction, aggression, downwards, but I don't know. It's just the type of principle I would be looking for. Like, we're not going to define what it means to be living. So we're not going to provide a whole theory because we don't need that. But we're going to say social worlds, living creatures within life, those systems where survival is guaranteed by the mediation of the synthetic gluing and not directly by the atoms. Like, if you look at the part, you won't see, but socially meaningful parts don't contain everything they need to be alive, right? The problem with the theory of labor is that it thinks that the name for everything you need to do to be alive is labor, and that's not a good idea. So let's just call that everything you need to do to be alive. Well, the social part is never including all of that, right? Like your physical living system and your capacities to bring food to your mouth and take care of yourself. No, it's smaller than that. It's cut in weird ways, but those weird ways is the things that actually get glued, right?
Yes. So as long as they can be re-glued in this social totality, it's possible. I think the weird thing that we haven't, like, I think this is like we're just beginning to see this. It's a strange, at least for me, I'm still like working my way through the atomic logic, but it seems like there's a curious inversion that solves some of the unfinished business in the logics of worlds.
Yeah, because I mean, from our perspectives, social reproduction guarantees survival first of the gluing itself, then of some of its parts. But once it does that, it breaks from the idea of living. You cannot guarantee that what you do to survive guarantees that you live in a sense of, being participating on something whole in a larger sense. So I think it's a good reason also to keep participation to something else, so that you can also say that, like, as Caron says, in the clumsy cat thing, like, you want to be able to say that socially you survive, but you need art to live. So you want to say that you need some other type of atomic division where practices are divided in different ways, where something that looks useless from the standpoint of social reproduction is actually very necessary from the standpoint of like meaningful life.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. I think the problem of true life appears from that perspective.
Yeah, we can give it a materialist twist. Yeah.
Yeah, because it appears as from that inversion, a new problem appears, which is exactly one that I agree. It's not. I agree that participation should not be used in this because it is the solution to the problem that arises from this inversion of social life.
Yeah.
So this has to do with the ending of the paper, right? With the closure at infinity, right?
Yeah, I think so. But I think we can only put like brush strokes. We can't like.
Yeah, I added a mention at the section on history just to make a distinction, which is to say, people are used to defining historical progress and backwardness and advancement in capitalist societies as if it is connected to science. But clearly the temporal logic of science doesn't respect this, because somebody working on, I don't know, prime number theory is actually closer to, Euclid, that it's closer to somebody living next door to them. So the temporality of science doesn't really respect the idea of progress. It's just certain technologies put inside the capitalist world to guarantee some things happening, temporal processes for being completed, spatial distinctions to be overcome, and so on, that get incremented as the world expands. You need more technology because bridging gaps between spread out atoms require, non-social means. But that's not the same as saying that science has anything to do with progress. So that could be extended as a general argument for generic procedures, right? It can actually give a kind of concrete materialist meaning to eternity, in the sense that it's just processes that, depending on what you do, it's not canonically define beforehand what other people in history you will be close and far away from. Picasso was closer to a caveman in some sense than he was close to other painters of his time at points. So that's eternity, right? But it's materialistic. You just need to have the right theory of time and history to say that, right? So I think it can start giving like a better basis for some of the crazy statements we've read, and also give them our own twist later on. I mean, I knew that the principle of exclusion, I wanted to comment like on the debate before. Today, I know that there was a lot of talk on the chat about the possibly changing, right, the abstract versus concrete. From the amount of conversation about it, it does seem like it's way too charged words. Like the idea is not to over politicize the quadrants, right? Just to give them like as neutral as possible distinctions that people can just pragmatically situate things they know and compare them without making a big judgment in terms of preference, even though, of course, we're making the claim that we want to sell our own idea, right? And we do think that it inherits parts of other things, but I have the impression that abstract and concrete wasn't very convincing, and more than working through specific concepts of it, if it's not immediately good, I think it's enough grounds to change it, you know?
I misunderstood actually. So for me, it was kind of problematic because it wasn't clear what it did mean.
Yeah.
This is why I didn't understand that the STP was supposed to be the fourth quadrant or something like that. Because I think abstract domination is familiar from, you know, Urts and, you know, crisis group and these kinds of, you know, value from theory. They talk about abstract domination. But
yeah, that's the only reason why we chose this.
Yeah, I understand that. This is clear enough. The problem is abstract emancipation for me has a ring of ideological thing to me. Like German ideology, like, oh, it's just an abstract kind of emancipation. It's not real emancipation or something like that.
You know, the original version of the quadrants used personal and impersonal. So personal emancipation, personal domination, in the sense of you can actually look at the people to know what's going on, and you're freeing people, specific people. And impersonal was like mediated and so on, but it doesn't really do it as well, you know?
But it's clearer for me, at least, yeah.
Yeah, so... No, I think that's enough reason to change it. Yeah,
I think the best one was John's, but it's not. I don't think it's practical for the text, which is extensional versus structural. But I understand that for the address of the text, it's not really good.
I think structural is pretty good. I'm not sure about extensional. Perhaps coming up with another candidate for the concrete part, which is not extensional, but structural, I think is pretty good.
Median said conjunctural. I thought it was good just because it means like looking at exactly what is there. Don't know.
The structural is there as well. Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, but there's a slight difference, which I think is important, because it's not that one is terms and the other is relations. It's one that terms are the point of view that is conducting this, what's appearing, and in the other it's the inverse. The relation is what. So I think that it might be a subtle difference, but
yeah, but I think it takes too much, you know, work to explain.
No, from now I think it's nothing we're going to put there is going to be able to go without a footnote or a mini explanation.
A footnote, yes, but term versus relation, I think you have like 2 or 3 paragraphs to explain this.
No.
Yeah, no. That's the footnote explanation. The question is, in the text, what can we put that first? We won't automatically draw the wrong assumptions up. Second is the closest to the footnote explanation, like the minimal amount of steps. So conjunctural is usually like a moment in time, a period, a place. So it has that feeling of, you know, slicing things into a specific context or specifically set of elements, right?
Yeah, from that
So
point of
it
view.
does have that, but I agree. It's a word that we're not using very much. Not everywhere it makes sense, and it might be overdetermined by the fact that Althusser liked it. So people might think, it's an Althusserian distinction, even if we define it differently. So I get it if it's not good enough in that sense. Situated versus structural. But it's
Contextual.
yeah, I wonder, like, yeah, the you know, I don't want to use it because I think it's going to bring too much, like particular versus universal.
Then the wrong side of history for a lot of people without them ever reading the text.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. That's what I worry about. So yeah,
think
there's a
maybe-
rhetorical element, and I mean, since it's meant to be something kind of. It's not the content of the paper. We don't care for these quadrants. We just want to situate what we're doing in the easiest way possible. So we might not ever talk about this again. It's fine. So if it brings like a big discussion, we're already doing it wrong. You know?
No, maybe we should get like the least. We should get a pair that is simply uncharged. There's no, like, we take a pair of words that. I mean, of course they have to have some relation, but I think like we should avoid anything that can be easily situated in a certain tradition, because it's that we are constructing a hypothesis to split a map to allow us to situate. So I think that the solution, and I agree.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry.
No,
Keep
yeah,
going.
just saying that concrete and abstract, I mean, I liked it, but it's too charged. We'd have to explain ourselves too much.
Yeah, I'm going with Anna, and I think that Dennis just mentioned it. I tend to think conjunctural. It sounds a bit alien. It's not that usual. It has a bit of the Althusserian tone, but also most people don't know it. If in the footnote we just say we don't mean it in the Althusserian sense, we mean it in the sense of, and then we explain. I think that might be enough. You know, I don't know. For now, at least, personally, it's my favorite candidate, but it's a good thing for people to add in the revisions, to just go nuts and propose different things, you know?
And it would even allow us, but so we were, so structural emancipation.
Yeah, that's fine. Like systemic, structural, people get that, right?
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, and we even get to include more stuff in our quadrants involuntarily.
Like structural emancipation, it reminds me of structural racism, all of that kind of,
Yeah, I think where people will have a better kind of, we'll be more open to us with structure rather than abstract, while still looking weird.
And we actually get to like get some points, which is not something that we've worked, but for example, if we take into account discussions on racial domination, which is a mode, which is implicated in a certain mode, or so in a certain real abstraction, we would be like a few steps from being able to discuss, for example, structural racism, those stuff within our so I don't think it's something that gains us more than we lose.
Yeah, I agree. Also, so the principles that we need to define what social atoms are, the early introduction issue with how to name these things. I'm sure other issues will appear as we go, but I just wonder if there are any other like things we can clarify over the bulk of the paper. I mean, I don't know if you guys feel like it, but I do feel like it's very kind of step by step. Once Dennis starts introducing atoms, social atoms, multiple logic, scaffoldings, so on, like we really do use those tools to build the other concepts. It's not, and I feel like they're kind of neatly assembled, but I'm not sure if you guys get that feeling from the argument as well. Of course, you can read the paper afterwards to get a better feel, but just wondering, like we can either end it a bit earlier today, or if you guys have other points in the text we could clarify to help with the revision process.
I just would have like lateral kind of comparisons and things like that, but that's not really conducive to, you know, revision or anything like that. I think it's much more things that new topics that we might have for discussing after you finish the paper. Actually, for instance, one stuff that interests me a lot is the misalignment. And how does it relate, for instance, to the stuff that I am presenting in the same volume? For instance, the idea of the pattern and the norm, for instance. Like, this is something that interests me. And hearing you guys, I think what I am, it helps me in a certain sense, because I feel that what I am describing is actually more historicized. Like, the mismatch between pattern and norm is actually something that is historicized. Yeah, it's a sort. It's actually historicized in contemporary capitalist society in a certain sense. And this is something I might add. I might modify something in my paper under the light of what you guys are doing, and maybe put a footnote there or something like that. Actually, I do feel that to build a few some passageways between these two these two texts might be conducive to a kind of an interesting relationship within the same volume, because we're in the same volume. So this was one thing that struck me as interesting. Like, it seems like I'm talking about misalignment with a different vocabulary in a certain sense. And of course,
one thing. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Then by the lights that you are proposing, my account is a historical one. It's more historicized than I made explicit. It's not that I didn't think it was historical, but it's more historical than I made it explicit in the paper itself.
You know, the thing that I mean, I'm more and more convinced that these things kind of like, and also this is also something we tried to do it a bit in the last text, but I think we should try it a bit more. Like, so if you have any ideas on how to push it in that direction, I think it would be good. Like, there is much more language of, you know, propagation of rules, norms, constraints, and trying to kind of introduce that language to facilitate those bridges. So if you find places in the text where that can be accentuated also, I think would be great. But also there's something to it which I wonder if that's not in itself an interesting parameter for us to consider at some point, because in the social world, there is something different. Like, when you compare social with physical, you get a more kind of heavy distinction between pattern and norm, simply because some things are constitutively at the level of the ought, and you know, of what you can do, but you could not, you need to follow. And some things are constitutively foreign in the sense that they have structure, but they're just, you know, independent from that rule following aspect. But in the social space, that distinction can be contained within the social level, but be relative, because very, very fundamental, large scale norms, in the sense that if you were a country, you could change them, and therefore you are choosing to follow them. But if you are a person, they are patterns and not norms for that particular entity. So like, you could have like a scale intransitive aspect that differentiates between patterns and norms when both are social. You know, like, yeah, the communist movement would treat capitalist value logic as a norm that it can change, but an individual in a society relates to it as a pattern.
As a pattern, exactly. I think that's exactly the theory I'm aiming at, because at the end I'm using like the difference between theoretical and real object, and in a certain sense this is aligned with the idea of taking a real pattern as an object for intervention. And in the end, I'm criticizing the idea that you have like a scalar given, whereas if you have a certain vocabulary, you might see the same phenomenon at the immediate level, but also in different degrees of mediation, and therefore intervene upon it through different levels of mediation. In a certain sense, if you have the right tools for it, therefore you have to have like organization and all of that. So it's basically, it's interesting. What I find interesting is kind of, it's almost, of course, you derive a lot of different things that are not in the paper, is not what I'm saying, but it's, there's a kind of big overlap, like we are talking the same theory or the same bits of theory. It's a part of your theory, it's a part of my theory. with different vocabulary, which is interesting. Like it's really, really close. It's like the same thing. And it's not for nothing that in the end I'm talking about the STP in the end of the paper.
Yeah, I love that he calls like your theory and my theory. Like,
Yeah, that I was gonna say, it's almost as if for the past year
you've been working everyone together. Like, that's great.
No,
I mean-
sorry. So I'm taking the different papers as units. This is why.
you are
Yeah.
you are
The theory that
participating.
is in my paper and the theory that is in your paper. Like,
But you know what I would
participating in the true life of STP.
like, when we start deriving social time, social space, I think that if we derive either social actors or social scales, like something like that, will be like a direct kind of, we would just be adding further points. Of course, we probably cannot do it at this point. But if we were to have like, if this was a book, we just add a chapter there that says, like, there is a parameter which would call scale intransitivity, right? Where if you move from one type of part to a different type of part in the social world, you find different properties. A way of knowing you found different properties for different scales is that when you arrive at that scale and you try to find the language for that part, you will see that things that look like patterns now look like norms. They're just conforming structures, and things look like norms that previously was like patterns. So, for example, it's an interesting third dimension to add to space and time, which is kind of what actually counts as actors. Well, if actors are the instances that can justify their reasonings, right? And what they obey and they don't, and what counts as rule conformed kind of entities or processes. Well, you will find that actors look like different sizes depending where you are. And I would imagine that we can even make the claim that social actors project onto living individual human systems in all layers in centers. And they tend to project into different sizes of groups that not always are individuals in peripheries. So you can say everything you think as an actor and an agent in the center, just talking about yourself, because you are a real resolution at all levels. Whereas in peripheries, that's sometimes not the case. You need to talk about we to be able to describe what you're doing.
That's good, yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah,
that's that's serious, crazy shit.
No, I think that's
it seems like norm in a certain sense maps onto external relations and pattern into internal relations. You can't not be in the pattern. And while the norm is something that is doxastic, so in a certain sense, for instance, in the Marxian one, and the way that I'm trying to map the norm and the rules of the market, it is in a certain sense a knot, but a knot is something that also you may not do because it is a knot, it's not an is. Whereas the pattern is a constitutive thing, you cannot
not do it
without it. Not do it. So there's a kind of a constitution and regulation kind of pair going on between pattern and norm that kind of maps into internal, external, inside the boundary, outside the boundary, something like that.
But like this is exactly the missing piece to justify that hypothesis I mentioned to you and Rafael the other day about Wittgenstein, because what we're saying is that it's actually a triadic structure. You're saying rule obeying, rule conforming, but you need to say who is conforming and who is obeying, like the resolution of the actor. Once that variable is freed up and you need to actually fix it to answer that question, you can see that generally the actor for Wittgenstein is a person. And that's why it looks like you're only talking about a certain type of norm and a certain type of pattern. But if you were to unlock that parameter of what counts as an actor to other resolutions, you get a generalized theory of this, right?
Yeah.
I was actually thinking, because I was thinking while you guys were talking, for example, what would be between saying and doing in tropical Amazon? The problem of the problem of patterns. I was thinking, because I mean, if you take like the issue of patterns and norms from the point of view of these different types of encounters that we have according to the different modes, I mean, it's like the knife and the cheese. And I do think that I was really thinking because it also allows us a further point to develop. I mean, all this, it's like, I think that through this paper, and I mean, it's getting late, so I think I'm free to say this. I think that there is something, a guiding thread that we should maybe not let go, even as we finish the paper, because I think that there are like sequential developments that will take less work. But once we do them, we might have something that that will really, I think, maybe even allow, I mean, because we go from all the way from, we start from social theories, different social theories, and then we go to the logic of atoms in a way to understand them. So history, politics, history and geography, and then we're going through norms. And I think like the forms of navigating between norms and patterns is more clear once the distinctions between patterns and norms is worked out in this scheme. So I actually think that, I mean, it's a pity we are not doing a book for historical materialism, but I think that's what we are doing.
Maybe they liked so much that they would commission a book after this.
Yeah, they'll love it. Oh. Yeah, but I think like this, we should like, I think there are tasks that would be nice to just develop. This is not, and this is, I think, something that we haven't done as a group. I mean, we've talked about doing, but we have not unfolded thoroughly our insights as much as we liked. And I think this is a pretty clear opportunity, because this is like a slide that a third of it is built, and we can just like continue sliding down with least effort than I think we can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, let's just recognize the fact that we managed to do a presentation with 5 people for the first time in the STP today, like in 1 hour. That's not, you know, so it is like building up. I do think that this method that it's at stake in how Dennis is defining social atoms, how we're deriving social time, social space, this method is really useful, like to think, okay, what parameter can I restrict and get a class of similar looking phenomena that is interesting to highlight? For example, let's now look at different sizes of parts. Like there are like, one is a small resolution, the other is a, of course, you need to find a good way of defining what resolution means, or what, you know, let's look at, you know, only how this appears to certain type of cognitive agents, or let's look like how this appears if you're only looking at, you know, kind of the passing of material, kind of the material flow of things. Like, so different ways of restricting this will just open up a whole different theory that we will know that it connects with the rest, you know, but just every new dimension we're adding, it's like multiplying the amount of stuff we can say by infinity. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
In a certain sense, we can recognize other people's theories within that.
Yeah, I like that so much.
Like when you see, like when you think of flows of, you know, the material flows, you recognize Lyotard, you recognize France in the 70s. When you look at cognitive agents, we recognize maybe Sellers, maybe some stuff in analytic philosophy, and there you go. Like you can recognize a lot of different things. They're shifting around, tinkering with these distinctions.
But I think that the thing you mentioned, man, is it's definitely, you mentioned the other day we met here, and you mentioned it again now. Like I really think it's probably the closest thing for us to fleshing out, because it's already kind of formally the same ground. It's underdeveloped clearly, you know, and also the moment that we put it in some terms like this Brandonian approach to practices, like it sounds like it's around the corner the moment we can just, you know, let us restrict in this way and look only at this type of thing, and then we will get like a historicized theory of this thing. So it looks like it's very close. It would be really good to start thinking of how to strategically do that.
This is why I'm rereading, you know, the book, and I have that logic suppose here, so trying to think of the relationships and all of that. Yeah, I still have to reread it. So. But yeah, I have this
Yeah.
intuition that there's an interesting relationship there between because they are both using category theory to do composition of stuff. Like there's composition is a crucial word in the Brandomian, in this book in particular, the composition of abilities, but it's not the composition of atoms or referents, it's a composition of abilities. This is why he says that, for instance, maybe one vocabulary is a pragmatic meta vocabulary for another vocabulary, which means the vocabulary is able to say what you are doing when you are engaging in the other vocabulary, even though it doesn't say what the other vocabulary says. It says what you do when you use the other vocabulary. And they don't have the same kind of, expressivity. When one vocabulary is able to say what you're doing when you're mobilizing the other vocabulary, the second one is sometimes clear. It's clear that it's more expressive than the first one. Then they have this theory of pragmatic expressive bootstrapping.
Yeah.
And he's able to, account for the emergence of a certain set of abilities through this kind of formalism, which means he needs a compositional approach to practices.
Mm-hmm.
Which from the gist of it looks like something that we may be able to integrate somewhat, like this compositional approach to practice, not only social worlds or reference that are in a certain sense the nature of which are open, but this pragmatic thing.
The thing that I think we're gonna run not against, but we're gonna have to deal with is that since this is discussed in another conceptual language, of course it's gonna weight on distinctions in a different way. And I feel like it's both meant to be much more general. I mean, again, if we define the social as those things that are caught up in this downward survival kind of gluing and so on, practices are much broader than that because they describe things that have no bearing on this at all, and they're not highlighting those aspects. So in one sense, it's much broader than what the social theory is doing. On the other hand, it's not so clear if some of the fundamental components of the theory in terms of what counts as an agent, what is the structure of that, and so on, if those couldn't be more historicized in the sense that we can decompose them into things that take on, let's say, certain parameters to appear the way they do in pragmatic theory. So I wonder, what type of adjustment needs to be made so that the connections can be clear. But I don't think it's much.
Yeah. I'm excited for that.
I think that this would be really cool.
It's a good venue for exploring, I think.
I mean, we're going to have so many footnotes that read Kozelek, check. How about that fella? Check. Do you see the clear connections with pragmatic, philosophy? Just a big footnote, by the way.
Just for the lulz, I'm not going to do this, but I really want to read Bruno Latour's Philosophy of History, or whatever he does that Isaac can just put it on that footnote and say, here's where your God is.
Oh shit.
Wow.
That got a bit personal.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that if you project everything we're differentiating back onto mode A, as if there's only mode A, so everything is a person, because pretty much the form of agency in mode A is personhood, right? If you project everything back down, flatten it on mode A, don't allow other modes to exist, and you define one point of view, which is pretty much a state-like point of view, because you're allowed to classify everything in a consistent way. So if there's one thing which is at the level of the state, everything else must be at the level of mode A, but projected down in a kind of empiricist ethnographical sense, you get that philosophy. No wonder it's called the Prince of Networks. Literally, it's the Prince. If it's in that position of a sovereign looking at everything flattened in a plane of immanence or whatever it's called, right? You kind of get that, like everything is in a network and every point of view is a person's point of view, and anthropomorphic symmetric anthropology. It's kind of like that. So
so just so
it's a
we can-
footnote that starts with, this is a take, then 2 points, and then you say that. How about this take?
How about, yeah, just so we can finish, because I think like it's close to 9, so just wondering if, I mean, just reminding again that the text is available in the STP chat. I think it's in the main community, right?
Mhm.
So the suggestions, the instructions, they are available in there's a link to the instructions inside the text. And we have a deadline, but if you are not able to contribute for this deadline, I think it's something that we should look into continue investing after this deadline passes. So I think that if you are busy or something, this is not something that should be worrisome for this aspect.
Yeah. Guys, we did it. Yeah, let's. So now from now, I'm gonna finish section 16 tomorrow. But we have from tomorrow until Friday pretty much to edit. And I think we should just ask in the main group if anyone wants to be added to the editing group for the sake of the revision process, perhaps, right? And I do think we should find people to kind of offer to do the global revision, to harmonize the text, and to do the formatting also. I mean, those 2 things shouldn't take that much, but and other than that, just add your comments following the references. You can find on top of the document the link to this presentation. I'll add the video link there as well. Anyway.
Yes. Yeah, and it would be good if native English speakers could also take a part of this, because even if we have non-native English speakers doing the revision, I think it's essential to having people, because I mean, this is a lot of people, and most of the people who wrote were not non-native speakers. So I think a lot will pass through. So I think it's important to emphasize that. I think we can do that when we post it on the group.
Yeah. Great, guys.
Okay.
Okay.
You all.
See you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.